Okay. Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our second Historical Thinking Skills webinar as part of our Historical Argumentation webinar series. I'm Lynn O'Hara. I'm the Deputy Director for Educational Programs at NHD, and I'm here with Dr. Christopher Hamner from George Mason. As we get started, huge thank you to our friends at the Library of Congress for supporting this program and giving this opportunity to so many of our NHD teachers and coordinators across the nation and around the world. All right, couple quick reminders as we get going. Google Classroom is emailing you right this moment to tell you that your Webinar 2 assignment was not turned in. Don't worry about that. We've got to go in and manually update that. I promise I'll do it. Just hit delete on that email. Don't take a bit of stress from that. Quick note for on the thesis statement activity, the bulletin boards that you've been working on those discussion boards this module. Please, I know this is a hard thing to swallow, but I'm going to be honest, nobody's first draft looks like this sandcastle. And that's okay, right? Nobody's first draft ends up looking as beautiful and as crafted as this. Honestly, most people's first drafts are still getting around here. And I want you to know that it is 100% okay. Sometimes when we're writing, we have to get started with something. And sometimes it's just kind of like a lump of clay or a pile of sand. It's not a whole lot, but it gives us something to start with. We don't hold off on this activity because we want you to get something grounded and then to grow from there. The point of the activity was to get you feedback. You've got some peer feedback in there. You've got some instructor feedback. You've even got some NHD staff feedback. We've been filtering into different boards. I've been doing an awful lot of reading while I'm on the road this week of the drafts. And a couple reminders. Go back to the thesis statement video. Remember those 4 elements as you're revising. Are you clearly stating your topic? Are you defining your time parameters? Are you making explicit connections? Is there a turning point? Are there multiple turning points? And number 4, the toughest one, make sure it's an argument, not a statement of fact. If we can check it on Wikipedia, it's not an argument. We've got to have something we can argue against. I did go through and drop in some tips into the stream of each section based on kind of reading everybody's as you revise. Keep those ideas in mind. Remember too, writing is not really about the first draft. It's really about the revision process. My strong suggestion, show your students what you're doing, right? Show them your first draft. Show them the feedback you got. Show them what questions you then asked. Show them what your next draft is going to be and show them how it evolves through this class. I think it's really important that we model learning and make it visual and make it obvious for our students. All right, a little bit of housekeeping. First off, live captioning is turned on. It's computer generated. It's not perfect. If it helps you, great. If it distracts you, just hit the live CC button. It'll turn it off. Change your mind, hit the button again. You've got access to the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring that, and Christopher and I will be happy to answer any and all questions about the course, about the content, the history, the pedagogy, NHD, you name it, we'll try to answer it. Remember, you've got to take the survey at the end for attendance credit. That's how we know that you're here. If you run into technical problems, we'll get that video posted and links and any other helpful resources to Google Classroom in the morning. What's coming up next week? Optional office hours, Wednesday the 25th, 3 to 5 Eastern time. If you have questions, feel free to drop by. You don't need to register, just show up. The link's in Google Classroom. If that time period doesn't work, not a problem. Shoot me an email, give us days and times. And remember, please tell us what time zone you're in. That is helpful. And I will make sure that either I can meet you or Krista can meet you or your facilitator can meet you. We will definitely get somebody on the line if you're struggling or have some questions. Your assignment for Module 2 is due next Friday, so a week from Friday at noon. In it, what's it's going to include? First off, your revised thesis statement, right? You get a chance to make revisions based on the feedback. You're going to find 2 Library of Congress sources. One from the packet that you haven't done before, not one you used in Module 1, that wouldn't be any fun. And one that you go find in the Library of Congress. And we're going to do a session at the end on specific tips and strategies to help make that successful. And what we're going to ask you to do is compare and contrast and link these 2 sources. using either hindsight, agency, or perspective, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to ask you to highlight the key words or phrases that help us know. And again, point, keywords, key phrases. Please don't turn in an entirely highlighted paragraph. When you turn that in the same day you turn it in, Module 3 will launch. All right, that's the housekeeping bits. I'm going to turn things over now to Christopher Hamner to jump us into some more historical thinking skills, and then I'll jump back in a little later to talk about some tips for searching the Library of Congress. So, hey, Christopher. Christopher,
can you hear me?
There you go. Now we can hear you.
Hey, thank you, Lynn, and thank you everybody for coming back. I am really excited to pick up with some of the themes that we jumped into in our first historical argumentation session last month, which really dealt with this process of turning primary sources, the raw material, into a finished historical argument. I actually used this book, David Blight's Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, with my graduate seminar on Monday, and I got another master class in the process of taking the raw stuff and turning it into the finished product. It's not magic. It's not alchemy. It's something that everyone can learn to do, and everyone can learn to do better. In our first session, we talked about the building blocks, which were the 4 historical thinkings: sourcing, close reading, corroboration, and contextualization. The great thing about these skills is you can introduce them to students in a series of short explanations, and then you can spend the rest of the school year practicing and getting better at them. I'm still getting better at them a quarter century into my career. One of the things that we got in the feedback was the utility of the think alouds. A lot of you found that to be a really valuable exercise, and I'm really thrilled to hear that. I think it's incredibly powerful. We didn't invent the think aloud. In fact, Sam Weinberg, in his book, Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts, used it to start collecting ideas about historical thinking skills. But listening to an expert talk through something that they're already extremely experienced and well practiced in is such a powerful pedagogical tool, and I found it to be really powerful on both ends. So when I'm trying to learn a new skill, like a musical instrument or a sport or ballroom dance, to take an example, it's so helpful to hear somebody who is already so good at doing that activity that it almost seems like magic talk about what they're thinking about at every moment, where their weight is, or how they're using the knife, or how they're listening for specific things. And then on the other side, as teachers, I think the think aloud is really powerful for us because a lot of us are teaching things that we're already really comfortable with. And doing a think aloud kind of forces you to slow down and be aware of what your own thought process is. So students find it really helpful to hear it, but I think it's also really instructive for us as we kind of force ourselves to walk through and make explicit what is going on in your head while you're doing an activity that you've performed expertly for so long, it's almost second nature. So I'll have more think alouds tonight, don't worry, but it's a great technique to bring into your classroom in all sorts of circumstances. So we started with the basic building blocks, which drew our attention to the creator and audience of a primary source, the tone and mood, the kind of ways things are being said, the fact that multiple sources are in play and in conversation with each other at any given moment, and the idea that all of these primary sources come into a world in which other things are happening. Those are the basic historical thinking skills and the basic building blocks. But to me, that's not the end, right? The basic building blocks are sort of like learning the C major scale. It's an important step in your development, but nobody wants to sit and just listen to someone play the C major scale up and down for hours. At some point, we want to start actually making music, and that means taking the building blocks of the scale and putting them together in ways that enable us to answer some more complex and interesting questions. So today we're going to start talking about the process of going from the C major scale to, Miles Davis playing jazz. And if history is the study of change over time, mostly what historians do is create interpretations to explain change over time. So a nice definition of historical interpretation is the one that you see here: the process of gathering primary source evidence and then analyzing it to create some sort of coherent narrative or argument. That's what historians are doing most of the time. And so much of that kind of historical interpretation and historical argumentation revolves around the kind of change over time that is cause and effect, the how and the why of events and phenomena in the past. And there are a zillion different kinds of questions we could ask about cause and effect. Just in American history, I pulled out a bunch that you see in the background of this slide, but this is just a tiny, tiny pinprick in the total possible numbers of questions that historians can and have asked about the past and change over time. Tonight, we're going to talk about a second set of skills that are kind of combining the initial historical thinking skills and a kind of a suite of interpretive tools that help us make sense of groups of documents. So once we've applied historical thinking skills to individual sources, how do we start assembling those, analyzing them, and interpreting them to create a kind of argument? And the ones that we're going to focus on tonight are perspective, agency, and hindsight. And I'm going to give you some definitions and some examples of each that we might see in the past or in current events. And then we'll do a couple of think alouds at the end, and you can listen to me practicing one of these tools, one of these skills aloud, and see if you can identify the one that I'm using. So let's start with perspective. This is a common concept that you hear floated around a lot. But it has a very specific meaning in the context of academic history. And I think of perspective as being aware of historical figures, relationships to events, and then being aware of our own relationship to events, so that we're always talking about a series of relationships. People in the past, who we call historical actors, have some sort of connection to the events that they're participating in. And then we have some sort of connection to those events too. Perspective is a way to start thinking about that. And so to get myself started thinking about perspective, I ask myself some of the questions that you see here. Who produced this? What are their particular interests? And how do those interests perhaps shade their interpretation of events? Now, you ought to notice that some of those questions sound a lot like sourcing and contextualization, and you can kind of see how the building blocks are being used to produce something that's a little higher level. One of the things that I really emphasize with students and teachers that I work with is that every source has a perspective. And I think that's really critical because a concept that comes up a lot when I'm teaching is the idea of bias. A lot of my undergraduate students in particular are very keenly attuned to what they perceive as bias in sources. And often I hear them say, well, I don't want to use that source because it's biased. We have to throw this out because it's biased. Or doesn't that person have a bias? And I find thinking about bias not particularly helpful as a historian. I prefer to have my students think about perspective instead. So for example, here's a great Library of Congress document, the Declaration of Independence, and it clearly has a bias, right? It's drafted by Thomas Jefferson. It's submitted to the Continental Congress, which are a group of landed, propertied white men. And it is a pro-independence document. I mean, all those things are, not just woven into it, but front and center. So Jefferson has a bias. He's rich, he's influential, and he believes that the colonists in North America should break free of Britain. There's a bias there, but that doesn't make me want to throw this source out. I mean, this seems like an incredibly important source for learning about American history, and particularly the late 18th century American history. What I want my students to do is be aware of Jefferson's perspective, a particular way of looking at the world that springs from Jefferson's own place in it, his own experiences, and his own ideas about how the world works and how the world should work. There's bias here, but we don't want to get rid of the source on that basis. This is a terrific source that's recently surfaced in the National Archives, and we referred to it very briefly in the first webinar. It's a letter that's prepared by an FBI operative who anonymously types it up and sends it to the Reverend Martin Luther King. And if you read it, it's an incredibly kind of menacing document. It's essentially arguing that King should do the right thing by ending his own life. It's an extortion letter, and it has a terrible and obvious bias in it. It's anti-King, it's anti-civil rights, it's anti-nonviolent demonstration. It's the bias just jumps from every paragraph. I don't want to throw it out just because it has an obvious bias, and I would be really cautioning any student who says, I can't use this document to learn about the past because it has a bias. Say, well, it has a perspective, but that perspective can teach us a lot about the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement, the relationship between the governed and the government. And so rather than just say, oh, this is biased, we have to toss it, say, let's make sure we're aware of the perspective and then see what else the perspective can tell us. And this is just a habit of mind that we want to develop in our students to understand the relationship between people in the past and the events that they participate in. One of the great Library of Congress collections is the American propaganda posters from the Second World War. And some of these are really it's kind of sweepingly ideological, and they have a really ennobling sense of what the war is about. There's a great example here on the left that has American GIs in 1943 marching in front of the Continental Army of 1778 and making this argument that Americans have to go fight the war in Europe because that's what Americans do. Americans fight for liberty. This is not a source that's without bias, right? It's produced by the American government through the Office of War Information. It is specifically trying to sway Americans to think about the war in a particular sense. So it's biased, but it's a great source. We just want to be aware of the perspective when we think about it. And there's so many things we can do a little corroboration by getting another similar source from the same time period. So just a year later, the German government's Office of Propaganda will produce this poster, which is also obviously biased against the Americans. And there's so much fascinating stuff going on here. But rather than just say, oh, this is a piece of Nazi propaganda, it's biased, we should throw it out, we want to think about perspective. What is the German government trying to accomplish here? And what have they done with that kind of amalgamation of all these weird details about the sort of monstrosity of the American war effort with a Ku Klux Klan hood and a noose hanging down and a sort of prisoner's arm holding a Tommy gun, and then all of that under the red text liberators, right? Both of these things are talking about the same phenomenon, that is Americans waging war in Europe in World War II, but they have really different perspectives. They're both biased. We want to harness the perspective and learn from it rather than throw it out. Okay, so that's perspective. And I think it's a useful way to kind of think about sourcing and to think about corroboration and to think about close reading and being aware of what each of those historical thinking skills can teach us. The second of the skills I'm going to introduce tonight is agency. And this is, I think, the most powerful one that we have. Just as I said, of the 4 historical thinking skills, the one that I spend the most time focusing on in my own work is close reading. When I am sitting down thinking about a group of sources and how they interact and how they might reveal some insight about the past, often the thing that I am spending the most time trying to puzzle out is agency. Again, this is a word that you see all the time, just kind of in everyday life or in public. It has a variety of meanings. For historians, it has a very specific meaning. And historians use the concept of agency to refer to the ability to make consequential decisions that affect events. it's often described as power. And I think that's a sort of very loose, but somewhat useful definition, but power defined in ways that aren't always obvious. So I sometimes think about leverage. Sometimes when I'm talking to my undergraduates, I just say, who's got the juice here? Say 50 years ago, historians tended to find agency in a very small number of people, presidents, generals, political leaders, Churchill or Washington or Napoleon. And that was a way of thinking about the past that was, often identified with the concept of great man history, right? The people who have agency are the people who have formal power in the political or military structure. And the rest of us have no agency, and we just have to kind of deal with the decisions that are made by the people way up at the top of the pyramid. In the last generation or two, historians have become a lot broader in their thinking about who wields power. And they have found that there are some obvious sources of power that are apparent to almost everyone, but there are many, many, many instances of people using influence or leverage, even if they are further down on the sort of, the social economic pyramid, that they are able to exert leverage or influence in all sorts of ways that are apparent once you start looking for them. And so when I'm thinking about agency, the questions I'm thinking about, who's got it in this particular situation? And where does it come from? What's the nature of the influence or power that they exercise? How can they use it? How's it limited? Almost no one has completely unfettered agency. Even, very obviously powerful people like the President of the United States have ways, formal and informal, in which their agency is bounded. And then that last question that in some ways is the most useful, which is how other actors are exercising their own agency, sometimes in coordination, sometimes in opposition, because this is where a lot of history gets made. A lot of the change over time is people or groups acting either in concert or in opposition to one another to try to push or pull events in a particular way. We've all lived through the pandemic. If you teach in a district that has a union, you live through a way of expressing agency. No individual teacher has quite as much overt political power as, say, the governor of your state. But if all of the teachers have agreed to collectively work together and to create a set of shared demands, and then to say withdraw their labor if those demands aren't realized, you are exercising or attempting to exercise a kind of agency. So you don't necessarily need to be, the district superintendent or the governor of West Virginia to exert agency in different kinds of situations. But sometimes you have to look for it a little bit. And this is a part where I have to sometimes slow my students down a little bit. We looked in our first webinar at this runaway slave ad, which is posted by Thomas Jefferson. And there's one very obvious kind of agency here, which is Jefferson's agency. And the origins of his agency are pretty obvious, right? He's rich, he owns other people, he's influential, he's literate, he has a landed estate, he is rising up in the government of the colony of Virginia. I mean, his agency, his power is pretty obvious. He's going to be president of the United States in a few decades. That agency is pretty easy to spot, but there's another kind of agency that's visible here. You have to just look and think for it a little bit. And I would say that agency is in Sandy, the enslaved Black man who has run away. Now, Sandy isn't an obvious candidate for agency because he exists in a system that is very explicitly designed to deprive him of agency. That is, he doesn't have basic choices about where he goes and what he does and how he spends his days and who he marries, and all of the wealth created by his labor is stolen from him. But in one sense, Sandy has exercised the one piece of agency he has, which is he's run away. He's taken his person and he has fled. And that's a really powerful kind of agency. And it's one that Jefferson wasn't able to stop, right? Because Sandy got away. And this ad is proof that Jefferson wasn't able to present it. So we've got one kind of really obvious political agency. Then we've got another subtle but pretty powerful kind of agency in just saying, I am going to run the risk of escaping to try to make myself a free person. And that's a different kind of agency, but really important. We're seeing both kinds in one source. And if you start thinking about the world, you can see all sorts of ways in which formal agency, that is, the kind of agency that the governor of the state has by the state constitution, is often just one piece, and maybe not the most important piece, that there are all sorts of ways in which people interact. The United States unemployment rate after the pandemic, with a lot of stimulus spending, began to diminish dramatically, as you can see from this bar chart. I mean, this was a really unanticipated consequence of living through the pandemic. I don't think it's a coincidence that around that same time, fast food operations like McDonald's were trying to hire people for entry-level jobs at $18 an hour. And that's not because the people who run McDonald's franchises had suddenly gotten a lot more generous and decided to take care of their new hires better. It's because as there were fewer unemployed people, businesses had to do something to try to attract new workers. And so the market is a way that agency is being expressed to. Fewer opening workers, McDonald's responds in the only way that it can, which is to try to make their jobs more appealing by raising the starting salary. Agency is incredibly useful when we're thinking about the past, and I keep reminding my students that this is a historical thinking habit that is really useful for making sense of the present as well. So if you're following what's happening in Washington, D.C., you notice that the House of Representatives, one of the two houses of Congress, currently has no speaker. About just under 2 weeks ago, one of the representatives, Matt Gaetz from Florida, moved to oust then Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. Now, how did that happen? Like, where did that agency come from? There's nothing formally in the Constitution that says the representative from Florida's District 1 shall have the power to unseat the Speaker of the House any afternoon he decides to do so. This is a place where the agency is brought about in a more informal way. We have to think all the way back to January. Remember that Kevin McCarthy ascended to the speakership after a series of, I think, 13 votes. Before he finally got the majority that he needed to take the speaker's gavel. And to get that majority, he had to make a lot of concessions. And one of the concessions was that any member of the chamber could call for a snap vote as to whether he would continue the speakership. So right now, we have no Speaker of the House, which means that the House of Representatives can't do anything. They have voluntarily kind of given up that agency. And that's because there is a very small number of very hardline Republicans in the House of Representatives who are using their agency to prevent anyone from becoming elected. And that's a really interesting phenomenon just within politics. One of the reasons that Matt Gaetz and this very small number of representatives have all that agency has to do with something completely beyond their control, which is the breakdown in the partisan control of the House of Representatives. The Republican Party holds a razor-thin margin in the House right now, which means that a small group of just 8 representatives can effectively stop just about anything by voting against them. That's strange. Agency helps us see what's going on there, and Matt Gaetz saw it too. He said, the Republicans have such a narrow majority in the House. He said, that's bad for the Republican Party, but it's good for my group of hardliners, because if the Republican Party had a 40-seat majority, that group of 8 hardliners wouldn't have the agency because they wouldn't be able to block things. And so right now we've seen one of the houses of Congress grind to a halt. The Senate doesn't have this problem because they hold their vote differently. The majority party is the only party that votes in the Senate. And so agency is apportioned differently. The kind of influence, the kind of leverage they get, part of it is from the written rules, part of it is from coincidence and norms and kind of unwritten coalitions. And agency helps us make sense of that. There are some great documents in the Library of Congress that deal with the civil rights era. I pulled a few here that deal with the Montgomery bus boycott. And there's all sorts of patterns of agency that we can spot there. Just about everyone in the United States is familiar with Rosa Parks, whose arrest for the refusal to give up her seat on a bus is one of the precipitating events of the bus boycott. But the bus boycott doesn't begin and end with that singular act. Parks has a certain amount of agency because she is the planned inciting event. But on the left, you see some of the minutes from meetings about coordinating the bus boycott. And one of the reasons the bus boycott is so successful in Montgomery at this point is because Black Montgomeryites, collectively withdraw their ridership from the public bus system. And they do that at incredible inconvenience to themselves. They have to walk to work, or they have to set up car sharing, carpooling. They're exposed to the elements, but they withdraw their ridership from the public transit system in Montgomery. And they have agency there because the bus system in Montgomery is dependent on everyone's fares, Black and white, to keep operating. And so when the Black ridership is withdrawn, the system doesn't have enough money to function. That's a kind of economic agency that is converted into political agency. And there's an interrelated pattern there that you can start to spot if you know what to look for. Summer of 1864, in the midst of the Civil War, the Union is beginning to use political agency, legislative agency, to force soldiers to join the Union Army. And that's a kind of governmental agency that's compelling people to join the Army, whether they want to or not. It carries the force of law. In New York City, a lot of Americans decide they don't want to be part of the Union Army, that the war has turned into something that they don't support. And they exercise a different kind of agency, a kind of violent mob agency of burning down businesses and attacking the areas where the draft is being staged. That's a different kind of agency that's exercised in kind of mob faction without much concern about legal ramifications. On the right, you see President Lincoln, who responds using yet another kind of agency. Rather than pass a law that forces the mob to disperse, he calls in the Union Army. This is summer of 1863, I misspoke earlier. He calls in the Union Army and sends them down to use violent coercive power to disperse the mob and to force people to obey the law. And so just in this one summer, in this July of 1863, you see all these different kinds of agency coming to a focus on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. So that's agency. Your students will almost certainly want to refer to it as power, but I think a better definition is broader and thinks about leverage, influence, just the different ways in which individuals or groups can exercise, their juice, can flex to accomplish things they want to accomplish. Let's talk about the last habit of thinking, which is hindsight. And again, this is a term that almost everyone is familiar with just out in the wider world. We often hear the phrase hindsight is 20/20. For historians, this refers to the fact that events often make sense only after they've happened. We can go back and say, oh yes, this was the reason that thing happened. Hindsight's an incredibly powerful tool, but I also think it has some inherent dangers. And one of the things is it allows us, in knowing how things turn out, to go back and sort of say, oh yes, this, and this were the important things. And I think there's incredible value, not just in exercising hindsight, but in practicing turning it off, and thinking, what were the people living through this moment aware of? What could they see? And also, what could they not see? How could things have happened differently? We think a lot about turning points in history, and that's obviously the theme of this year's National History Day. But the people who are living through the past are not always aware of the importance of events as they're living through them. They can't see how things are going to turn out. We're all living in examples of that right now. So in 50 years, someone is going to write something about the Russia-Ukraine war that's going on right now. And they'll say, oh yes, well, now we know in hindsight that this and this and this were the turning point, because they will be looking at the past. But right now we're situated in the middle of it. And what will be the past is still one of, dozens and dozens of possible futures. And I don't know about you, but I'm confused as heck about what's going on. And I have no clear sense of how it's going to turn out. And so we have to kind of turn off our hindsight a little bit, or at least try to get in the shoes of people who are living through these events, because otherwise we get a little smug. I love to use the headline about the Titanic disaster, because to us, this is, famous as one of the great maritime disasters of the 20th century. But then you say, gosh, don't get on the boat. It's not unsinkable. But obviously things look very different to people in the moment. They don't know how things are going to turn out. If you pick up a high school history textbook that covers the first half of the 19th century, often they will say the thing that starts the country on a path towards civil war is the invention of the cotton gin. On the left, Eli Whitney figures out how to make a mechanical device that separates cotton seed from the fiber. That is going to lead to huge growth and demand for cotton, and then demand for workers who are enslaved to produce it. And Eli Whitney and the cotton gin are the sort of turning point. But it's not at all obvious to the people who are living through those events that that person, that invention, is going to lead to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and all of the things that are coming afterwards. And so while it's useful to use your hindsight to look backwards and to try to understand what the critical junctures are, I also think it's useful to try to turn that off for a second and say, what would I have known about this moment if I was living in the moment and didn't know how things were going to turn out? So I think hindsight is a powerful tool, but it can be used for good or for ill. All right. Hey, Lynn, what do you think? You want to do some think alouds?
I think it's poll time.
Poll time.
Get your
I love
mouse
it.
is ready. Let's get going.
All right. So what I'm going to do, I've got kind of 2 packets of sources. I'll do them separately. And I'm just going to kind of think aloud. I'm going to tell you what would be going through my head if I were encountering these documents for the first time here in my office at George Mason. We're thinking about cause and effect. We've got all sorts of questions. Let's go ahead and jump into the first set of documents. So I'm going to just start thinking aloud. Okay, I'm nervous. So we've got a group on the left. Looks like Black folks, and they're kind of well dressed. And then we've got a group on the right, and they look really menacing. And I'm kind of like really worried about the power dynamic here, because the group on the right looks they look menacing. They look violent. They look like agents of the state. I don't know if they're reservists or state troopers or what, but I'm kind of concerned because it feels like there's a sort of menace going from right to left. Oh, okay, so this is a different picture, I guess, of the same event, and it turns out that the group of Black folks is like pretty significant, and so maybe the imbalance is, I mean, the guys in uniform are like armed. This group is not armed. They're large though, so I'm still really worried about what's going to happen when these 2 groups meet, because there's a sense of ominousness there, and I'm worried about the power imbalance and the power dynamic. And now that this is kind of what I imagined might happen. It looks like the cops are just kind of using violent power on, I guess, a group that's demonstrating, and it looks kind of one direction, because it looks like the protesters aren't really opposing anything. They're just kind of accepting the beatings that these guys are giving. But now, you know what, I guess there's something else going on here, which is somebody's photographing all this, and that actually seems like a kind of power too, because I imagine when people start seeing these pictures outside of wherever this is, they might be kind of disturbed or revolted that a bunch of like peaceful protesters are being beaten by state troopers or police officers or agents of the state. And so there's a different kind of dynamic going on there about that they're kind of making this visible, and maybe that would advance the protesters' goals. I don't know. I got to think about this some more and see what else we've got. All right, that's very much the thought process I kind of went through the first time I encountered these documents. I was trying to lean on one of the historical thinking habits. They all kind of overlap. So, but I did my best to lean on one. Let's see how we did, Lynn.
All right. It's poll time. We got about 75% answered. Go ahead, put your best answer in. Again, get off the fear of don't worry about if you get it wrong, get it wrong. There's no harm in this, right? We're just learning. It's formative assessment. It helps us. It helps you. All right, we ready? Last answers, ready, set, go. All right, response of the group. 31% said perspective, 68% said agency, 1% on hindsight.
So I was trying to hit agency most notably, but I want to say here, like, I don't really think of this as a right and wrong exercise. Like, there's a lot of overlap in these concepts. So I was trying to use, references to power and leverage without using the word agency, but there's a lot of perspective in there too. And you can see like the Venn diagram is not separate ovals. Let's try another one. Same exercise. I'm going to just turn on the thinking out loud. Okay, so let me do some sourcing first. This is like a political cartoon. I think it's from the late 19th century. Yeah, and I'm thinking maybe this is kind of making a kind of mean racist fun of a guy that I think is Chinese. It's a kind of common way to draw a Chinese person in a distinctive hairstyle. So it looks like the vantage point is kind of anti-Chinese. Let me do some more looking, a little close reading here. Gate of Golden Liberty, this guy's been shut out. Notice, communists, nihilists, socialist, Fenians, and hoodlum welcome, no admittance to Chinamen. And the guy, the Chinese worker is bringing industry, order, sobriety, and peace. Okay, so maybe this viewpoint isn't anti-Chinese. I mean, this actually seems to be a vantage point of, and the cartoonist at least seems to be saying, we shouldn't be keeping this guy out. Look at all the people on the left that we're letting in. And then the text at the bottom, an enlightened American statesman says we must draw the line somewhere, Oh, so I'm seeing irony here. I mean, feels like the viewpoint of kind of criticizing American policy by pointing out its hypocrisy. So maybe the vantage point is a lot more pro-Chinese than I thought at my first glance. Right, that's what I thought the very first time I saw this. Let's play.
All right, here we go. Here's our second one tonight. Perspective, agency, or hindsight. The cool thing that I get to see is I get to watch the bars go across, which is a lot of fun. All right.
So agency has 0 votes. Is that because everybody thinks that I wouldn't dare do the same historical habit twice?
Oh, that might help. All
Maybe
right.
we'll mix that up next time.
Let's share what we've got here. Answers. 87% went with perspective, 13% went with hindsight.
Okay. So perspective was the thing that I was trying to lean on the most, particularly because you heard me say things like viewpoint or vantage point and the relationship between the cartoonist to the subject of the cartoon. But there's also a little bit of hindsight in there. You could hear me kind of applying some things that I know about that part of policy. And again, a lot of overlap between these things. They kind of work in concert, but they're habits of mind of thinking about how to fit together sources into something bigger that we can say about, yeah, this is how the past worked at this moment. This is how people were influencing events to try to get an outcome that they or their group wanted. Feels like a good time for me to hand the microphone over to Lynn, and I will stick around and answer as many Q&A questions afterwards as you guys care to throw at us.
All right. So we spent a little time, we talked about the thinking skill. Now what our goal is going to be is to talk about how to go and find sources within the Library of Congress in order to be able to further your research. Now, there's a couple things that you've got to know coming into this, and I think it's just a little bit tricky. One of the things that I think that I always have to remind myself when you're working with the Library of Congress is that it's not Google. And I think that's hard because we use Google, and Google really does a good job of influencing a lot of the other engines that have been built. But the Library of Congress's search for their online collections have always been a little different because they were built with a different purpose. They were never really intended for the public to search as much as individual researchers. So what I'm hoping we're going to do, I've been working with the library really intensively for the last 4 or 5 years, and we've picked up a lot of tips and tricks to help you access some of the amazing and vast resources. What we want to do is start off by saying, okay, before you sit down and put time into searching, you've got to stop and think about what your plan is. You've got to have a sense of what are the keywords you're going to use, what are you hoping to find, and how you're going to do it. And you have to also be really careful about not becoming Alice. And Christopher and I can both tell you that we have both started on research topics in the Library of Congress, and you start being Alice, you go down a rabbit hole, and then you find yourself in another rabbit hole, and you forget where you're searching. I've been there, he's been there, we know that feeling. On one hand, it's really cool because you find some amazing things. But you want to be smart and efficient about your use of time. And when you're like, oh my goodness, I have these maps and I can find my hometown, sometimes you got to say, you know what, I'm going to save that link and come back to it because I really want to focus on the Johnstown flood or the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All right, now, most of the time when you search, you're going to loc.gov and you're searching their online collection with their search bar. Couple things to notice. If you search, the default is going to be to search everything. You also then have the ability to filter down using the drop down on the left to just say, hey, I just want to look for a map. I just want to look for a photograph. I just want to look for a book. But I think sometimes you want to start a little broader. So what I did was I went to loc.gov and I typed in Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, in order to do this, a couple keyword tips we've got to think about. Broad terms don't work as well in the LOC search engine. You want to start to search for specific people and events. So one tip is look at some of the primary sources that we've given you and who are the people? What are the events being talked about? Being more specific can often be more effective. You also want to make sure that you're using era-specific language because the tags that are written and that is searched by their search engine were created by the librarians and the archivists when they were put into the library's collections. So we're not necessarily going to use the words that we use today. We're going to be using the words in the search that they use then. And this is really important, especially when you're working with your students. Less is more. Don't type in a whole sentence to that search bar. It's going to get you way too much stuff that has nothing to do. Think words, names, short phrases. As you go and get started in your research, a couple tips to help make this effective. First off, rely on the librarians and the archivists. One of the things that we put into your reading material this week was a research guide that the experts at the library have already created. We use these too. I go to their research guides all the time when I'm looking for new sources or a new topic. This is the people who are the experts in the collection saying, hey, here's some of the best stuff. So don't feel like you're cheating when you're using their archivist doing their tips and tricks. So we've got those linked in the reading materials. Hopefully you've been spending some time poking around there. Second thing, keep a list of what you search. Start to figure out what works and start to figure out what doesn't. And the only way to do that is to start a list. If maybe you've got 5 different names, let's go through them one by one. Give yourself some notes, what's effective or maybe what's not. Another tip for the Library of Congress, it will not autocorrect your spelling. So take a second and double check that the words you're putting in are spelled and typed correctly, because I think we all are very much used to AI and Google correcting our spelling or our mistyping. All right, so I did a search for Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it came up with 762,000 sources. Obviously, that's way too many. We're going to have to refine that down. So when you start with a search, let's talk about some ways to narrow down to get to some of the best stuff. First thing is the sort by. So this is a drop-down menu that'll pop up on the search page in the upper right-hand corner. You have a couple different options to sort by. The first is relevance. This is the librarian saying, hey, we think these are the most likely to be helpful. Again, don't fight that. The other two ways that you might find yourself sorting is either by date to put things in chronological order, or by title, which will put things in alphabetical order, which especially that's helpful if you're looking for something specific. But when you're just getting started, sorting by title is going to get in your way far more than sorting by relevance or date. Personally, I use relevance the most. All right, the next tip for narrowing things down is to use the refine your results bar on the left-hand side of the search page. That's going to let you narrow down to things. Now, this is telling you that there are 719,000 newspapers referring to something about Kansas, Nebraska, and Act. That doesn't mean the Kansas, Nebraska Act together. It means those three ideas. Starting there, probably not the most effective. But if we look down, 29 photos, prints, and drawings. Okay, that might be more useful. 5 maps, that might be useful. So again, with your notes, jot down what you searched and then the pathways you go. Maybe you check maps first. Then maybe you go back and do photos, prints, and drawings. Maybe then you start playing with it. But if you know your pathway, it's going to help you be more efficient. All right, let me tell you the other way that I find extremely effective, and it's a little counterintuitive. On the first page of the search results for Kansas-Nebraska Act, I found a speech from William Seward on the Kansas and Nebraska bill. So this is before it becomes a law. And I started looking through, I was like, man, there's a lot of really good stuff in here that I might be able to use. So I might pull this source because I've got, I can pull in, I can zoom in, I can pull some quotes on what he was saying. But there's a couple key tricks. When you scroll down below the source, you get the citation information on the left, but on the right, you get these gray boxes. In these gray boxes, it gives you hyperlinks to different ways that it is sorted or cataloged within the library's collection. So we know that it's a printed book. You could literally click that link and get all other kinds of books and printed materials. We could say, hey, what else did William Seward write? Did he give other speeches or did he write about this? And we can click and look at other sources written by him. Now, again, they may or may not be relevant to this particular act, but that's another pathway. We can look at other things printed in 1854. But what I find most useful is to go down to that subject act. What that is, if you click that Kansas-Nebraska Act linked, that is sources that the librarians have directly linked to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, not Kansas and Nebraska and Act. That's one tip. So find one good source and start to link through the subject bars. Also, if you keep scrolling down, this is like the ultimate algorithm, right? You buy one pair of shoes and then they tell you like, ooh, you might like these, you might like those. More items like this is more books and printed materials that might be useful. So I see, there's something by Charles Sumner. There's something about Missouri Compromise in Kansas. Again, some of them may be useful, some of them maybe not, but there's lots of good tips. This is like, you might like this. And if you scroll down just a little further, don't skip to get to the bottom here, you also get, you also might like. So here, there's papers collection, there's some newspapers, there's a photo print. I'm going to be honest with you, I find really good stuff in finding one source and then going down to you might also like. Because these are librarians go, oh, if you like this, you might like that. The other source that I'm going to strongly encourage you to check out, if you have not spent time here, this is one of my favorite places to find great primary sources, is the Chronicling America database. This is digitized scans historic newspapers from across the nation from the late 1700s through the 1960s. Its sweet spot is really about 1850 to 1925 or so. And you can do a standard search. You can also do an advanced search. Every year they do 100 years ago today. And if you're ever looking for like a quick warm up, like students will really get into what was being printed in newspapers 100 years ago today. We have two really helpful short form videos, one on doing a regular search and one on doing an advanced search. And if this is something to help you, I'm going to drop these in when I drop the slides and the bibliography and the video link tomorrow. This is another great source to find good primary source content. All right, we are just about at the top of the hour. So what we want to do is shift over to taking questions. Now, before we do that, please take a moment, grab your pen, write down the survey link. So it's tinyurl.com/NHD-HAWS Historical Argumentation Webinar Series 24, because it's the 2024 contest year. We understand that sometimes after an hour you do need to go. We will continue taping this if you want to come back and watch the Q&A tomorrow, but it looks like we do have a couple questions in the question box, and we would love to go ahead and answer any and all of the questions that you've got. So take a second, fill out the feedback survey. It'll send you a copy. It'll send me a copy. I'll go ahead. I've got the master list, get you checked off and get you your credit for joining us tonight. All right. Couple different questions. Corey, you had the question about, could we put the slide up for agency? I'm going to leave this slide on, but I'm going to share all the slides tomorrow in Google Classroom, so you can get and snip and pull those questions out. Hint, that can be helpful when you're doing your homework. You can go back and look at Christopher's slides with prompt questions. They'll really help you write that paragraph. That's the goal, right? We're not trying to trip anybody up here. We're trying to give you tools, and not only to do your homework, but then also to help your students think historically and layer one source with another. All right, Christopher, here's a really good question. Lindsay would like to know, how can we assist students in discovering era-specific language so that they can engage in better searches?
Wait, that's a great one. And I wish I had a sort of, 3 easy steps. One of the ways that I do it with my students is to give them a few primary sources that are relevant to whatever you're looking at. So if you're looking at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, I give them a couple of documents that are from that historical moment because those documents often contain that language. Some of it is a little opaque. So sometimes you have to do a little digging. And I have a bunch of students who are doing 19th century research, and they found the use of the word instant, which is not self-explanatory, but refers to, means this month. If you say like your letter of Tuesday instant, like that means this Tuesday. In terms of finding like period specific language, I use my textbooks a lot when I'm working in eras that I'm not familiar with. And then Lynn talked about falling down the rabbit hole. I sort of start with a document and then see what in there I might want to follow up on. And, in the old fashioned way, like when I find a word I don't really know, I use Wikipedia or Google, or then I email a professor who specializes in that and say, I'm having trouble with coming up with a term for this. Can you give me a hand? But probably my first line of attack is just old-fashioned textbook.
Mm-hmm. Let me add one other source to that.
Please do.
Chronicling America has created a thesaurus specifically relating to groups of people. It's referenced in our theme book in the article on Chronicling America, but when I put resources up tomorrow, I'm also going to drop this link as part of the resources. It specifically helps you search Chronicling America by giving you ideas that this is the term we would use today, but these are much more common terms from the past. So part of it sometimes is trial and error. But if you take a look at this source, this will give you some specific ideas to get students started. And then based on their research, this will help give them some options. And again, research isn't perfect. I know sometimes it gets frustrating because you feel like you want to have the solution. And sometimes you just have to play through things. Okay, I searched this, I searched this. It took the third idea. That's when I really started getting hits. And then I was able to reference those subjects and more like this, and you might also like. So I'll drop that into the resources as well. Or you can take a look tonight. It's in the theme book article about Chronicling America for 2024. So hopefully
that's a great answer. And let me just add to like Lynn's reference. I mean, to me, in my own research and with my students, it sometimes feels like kind of trying a combination lock, and you kind of keep trying a few things and it's frustrating, and then something gives and it opens up and it's rewarding. I mean, one of the great frustrations and delights of doing original research in primary sources is the things don't come with a post-it note that says, future historian, here's what you should use when you are trying to interpret or analyze my work. And so some of it is kind of educated guesswork, and some of it is just, brute trial and error, but it feels really, really satisfying when you do get that hit and when the lock comes open.
So I see a couple people with hands up. Remember, go to that Q&A box, type in your question. We're happy to answer them. Got a couple more in the queue. All right, here is a question. What is the correct way to cite Library of Congress research guides? Sue, since you're finding them on the internet, you cite them as a website source. If you're looking for some examples in the materials that you're reading, the Library of Congress teacher guide, the guide to student research and historical argumentation, we have a lot of those referenced in there. And at the end of each chapter is a bibliography in Chicago format approved by our friends at the Library of Congress. So you can check there. If you have a specific question, send me the citation and I'll help. But if you're like me, you get them off the internet. So we're going to cite them as something that came off the internet, cite it as coming off that website. So hopefully that helps. If I'm not answering that, let me know. All right, I've got a thesis question here. One of my students is struggling with his thesis. He's interested in soccer and maybe Pele. Any advice on making the connection to a turning point in history? All right, Christopher, this one's all yours. Go for it.
I will take this one, even though I'm going to be the first to admit that I do not know much about soccer. But one thing that strikes me as maybe a turning point is that I know that Pele, after a kind of long and decorated career, came to what was, I think, then called the North American Soccer League, and played for the New York Cosmos, which was kind of, I think like an example of like Lionel Messi kind of coming and playing for Major League Soccer at like a team that was not nearly as good as the one he left. But it did a ton to like raise the profitability and the visibility of soccer in the United States. And there's some cool like print ads and commercials about having the great Pele, the greatest player of the middle of the 20th century, coming and playing for kind of a rinky-dink North American Soccer League. And there might be something cool there. I would imagine that you can find some advertisements and some news stories about this electrifying figure who had sort of taken several steps down to come and play in the North American Soccer League, and how having a star of his caliber got Americans to watch soccer, at least for a little while. That feels like maybe a turning point. I mean, not, certain in terms of kind of American culture and American professional sports history. And I know I've seen some of the ads, so I know there's some primary sources out there to work with.
I got a question today about another kind of off the wall topic, and I told this here, so I'm going to tell you the same answer I tell any student. Do your research, find the turning point, and make the case. Because at the end of the day, if you can make the case, there are turning points everywhere we look. And remember too, as teachers, ask your students regularly, hey, we're getting to the end of the week. It's Friday. What are 3 turning points we talked about this week? Start bringing that vocabulary into your classroom. Students will start finding them. Ask them to find a turning point that got flipped by a different turning point. Throw that word into end of unit or end of chapter review activities. You'll find lots of good stuff. But I would say, I think there's some good ideas there. Do the research, see what you find. All right. Let's see here. Linda, here's a question. In the context of keyword searching, how can we determine when the materials were cataloged? This is one of the, I can answer this. This is one of the things that in the library, unfortunately, the librarians over time weren't always consistent. Some of the sources that you find will tell you when it was added to the library's collection. Sometimes it won't. So I can't say you can always 100% say whether these sources were added in, 1884 versus 1924. But that's where those keywords can come in handy. Those subject, that bar, the gray bar on the right-hand side of your screen, that can really help you because sometimes looking at the other words will show you what they're talking about. But unfortunately, it's not always in the record. I'm sure somebody at the library has the record of everything, but it's not always in the online record. All right. Kim, can all of the research be completed through internet resources? I'm not sure if you're asking about this class or through History Day. So let me kind of give both answers. Through this class, we're focusing on the Library of Congress. We've got teachers all over the world. We don't expect you to be able to go there. So yes, we're building off of all online available resources. In terms of History Day, I would do anything within your power to get students to a real library, to make sure they have that experience. Because while there's a lot of amazing things, there isn't everything. And I know that that can be a tall order. You may or may not have a school library. It kills me how many schools don't have libraries. It makes my heart hurt. But see if you can work with the local public library. I was teaching a workshop in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and they said their public libraries have a bus fund where they will pay for the bus to pick the students up, take them to the library, do a session with the library. The librarians will lead sessions or co-lead sessions with the teachers and then bus them back. So I would say if there's any opportunity to get your students to a library, please, please, please try to do that. All right, let's see here. Can you cite the LOC collection of sources as one source in an NHG annotated bibliography? When you're talking about the LOC collection of sources, I'm not sure exactly what you mean there. So if you can clarify that, we'll definitely answer that. But a good rule of thumb with NHG bibliographies is cite collections as collections. So for example, the Lewis Hines photograph collection of all like child labor collection has thousands of photos. If a student's doing a documentary and maybe they pull 40 photos from that collection, it's 100% okay to cite it once and explain that you grabbed a series of images that show this, this, and this from there. So I hope I'm answering that. And if I'm not, obviously clarify. All righty. Jamie, you're in trouble with the URL. Shoot me an email. I'll respond to you. Sometimes the tiny URL gets blocked by school districts. So I'll send you the direct link to JotForm, but I'll definitely get that off to you tonight. All right, let's see here. Corey said, pass on the question about Pele, that Pele, he believes, invented the bicycle kick, which revolutionized soccer. I don't know about soccer to verify that, but
another turning point. Yeah.
Check it out. Let's see here. Question from Heather. So just to clarify, as we work through these concepts, agency, perspective, and hindsight, we are to approach our research in the same way our students might approach it, i.e. thinking about how we want to teach these concepts to them, or approach this homework from our own personal perspective. All right, here's my suggestion, Heather. Tackle this like you're one of your students. Go take one of the sources, go find another source, and then help to layer them together. Our goal is to put you a little bit in their shoes, but then to give you models and examples that you can share. All right, Jamie, looks like you got the URL to work, so that's awesome. All right, I've got one more question here, but if you've got a question, please go ahead and drop it in. Oh, this is a good one. Some of my students want to do the performance category and want to do dance or songs as part of their entry. Although this doesn't follow the traditional theatrical performance, can it still be an effective NHD project? Great question. First off, the rules of NHD performances is a 10-minute limit, and then there's rules about props and things like that. Can students sing or dance as part of it? Absolutely. The two questions that I always ask when students want to do that, I say, first off, can you, right? Let's make sure you can. But second off, do you need to? Because I think sometimes song or dance can be very powerful in the context of the topic if it furthers the argument. Sometimes, though, it's singing and dancing to sing and dance. So I think you've got to think with your students, okay, if you've got 10 minutes to tell your story and to make your argument and to prove it, is the singing or the dancing helping that or hurting that? And sometimes it depends on the topic. So if your topic is songs of the civil rights movement, and you're talking about specific lyrics and specific trends in the music, well, that might be more effective. There was one on the history of tap dancing several years ago, and it talked about the evolution of the style of dance. Okay, that's more effective. Sometimes, though, it's somebody who just wants to perform. So I wouldn't say no, but I would ask the students, how is it furthering your argument? And will it help your argument? Or is it going to get in the way and eat up some of the 10 minutes? So that's what I would ask. All righty. Well, it looks like that's the end of our question box tonight.
That's it?
That's it. So that's okay. If you think of something later, shoot us an email, give us a call. We'll be happy to respond to you and get back to you. For those of you who know, I am teaching tomorrow. I will get back to you as soon as possible. But if you're getting the email bounce back that I'm working in New Mexico, I promise I'm actually working. And we'll get back to you either from the plane on Friday or definitely by Monday. So I'm going to go ahead and pause things there. If you haven't written down the URL for the survey, please do that. We will go ahead and stop the recording